드릴 분은 제가 이제 저희 아들 딸이 다니는 케임브리지 연합장로교회에서 알게 된 우리 집사님이세요. 그래서 제가 한번 세미나 하실 때 그때 이제 설교 뒤로 또 이렇게 세미나를 하셨었는데 그때 이제 저희 아이들이 청년들이 대부분 듣고 굉장히 좋아했고 또 저희 딸은 아예 그냥 1대1로 가서 1대1 레슨 상담까지 받을 정도로 뭐 우리 그때 목사님이 어나더 레벨이라고 소개를 하시더라고요. 그래서 여러 가지 하나님이 복을 많이 주시고 많은 이렇게 감당을 하시는 분이신데 성함은 이제 폴 권 집사님이신데 우리 나오실 때 여러분들 좀 여기 떠나가도록 한번 크게 인사했으면 좋겠습니다. 우리 권 집사님.
Thank you, 감사합니다. Actually, my entire talk is going to be in English because I moved to the U.S. in 1978 when I was 7, and so I'm infinitely more comfortable in English than in Korean. Although I'm married to a Korean woman who spent 10 years in London, so we can do both. But yeah, I'm infinitely much better in English, so it'll definitely be in English. And I'm not sure that I can even give this in Korean because I don't know I have the vocabulary in Korean. But I don't want this to be a lecture, so I want it to be somewhat interactive. So if everybody can move up, I think that would really help me. I know it's hard to do, and everybody says move up, and no one wants to do it. But if you move up, I think it'll be a lot easier. And maybe while you guys are moving around, the one other thing I can ask is, so I think Im Moksa님 sent you a link to a YouTube podcast. Did anybody have a chance to see it, watch it, hear it? Nope. Okay. So if you're interested in beyond my just few minutes of talking about it and go a little bit deeper and then maybe even like deeper later, it's worth watching because I don't watch I listen to the Bible Project every now and again as a podcast or on YouTube, but this one I thought was really special, and I think it really hits home because it asks some really tough questions. And the two guys that are on the podcast, their names are I think John and Greg. They had a great plan that was going to make them a ton of money in the future, and they were a little older than you as they were sort of doing this. But I think as they went to Harvard Business School, sort of met up and actually really discovered what God was trying to say to them about money, I think completely changed their lives. And it's not, maybe it's not surprising that God would sort of touch them as they were really exploring, but the way I think God touched them, I think is very special because I look at the world outside right now, right, and we live in like a very, very much me world. We live in a world where sort of money dominates, and we see it in the Bible, right? That's not necessarily sort of now, but it's been sort of historically that way. And God has a lot of caution against money and worshiping money, which I think a lot of us don't even realize we're doing it, and it happens. So again, I think it's totally worth it. And I'll give you a very, very short synopsis. Right? These two guys, they really they're Christians, and they were, I think, relatively faithful Christians. They tithe, and they go to church, and they have fairly strong conviction about God. They go to Harvard Business School, and they take a religion class about God and money, and they read a book that says there's no need to tithe, and they're like, what? How does that work? Because tithing is part of like going to church, and I think they'll tell you that they even thought like tithing is like a membership to church, right? And I think a lot of people just do it because you're supposed to do it. And when they read or read this book that says you don't have to, right? And then if you really think about it, God's sovereign. He doesn't need few of our dollars to make his plan come true, right? And then they start to realize, like, wait, the way we've been approaching money, and what God's been saying is not the same. It's different. And then they go on to like learn, and they do like a deep dive into money and what the Bible says, and they start to realize, like, wait a minute, like, actually the Bible says there's tithing, but then the Bible also says just absolute radical generosity to the poor and to your neighbors, right? And then when they actually did the calculation, it wasn't even the tithing, like, and all the things that the Bible said you should do wasn't 10%. It was something more like 20% plus. So if you can sort of imagine, if you made $100,000 and the Bible says give away $25,000, I mean, that's a lot of money, right? And then they started to realize, like, oh, our concept of what the Bible's been saying is totally different than what actually God's saying. So they started to like sort of challenge themselves, and they even sort of reached out to their alumni who were Christians that also went to Harvard Business School to find out how they sort of perceive money. And then they found lots of interesting data set, and I think they even found a few folks that are in like very wealthy, I mean, they're in very, very prestigious hedge funds, and usually those guys are probably in the seven-figure range. And so in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, they could save enough money to basically retire, and they choose to give away most of their money, and they only keep a small portion, and they say, okay, I'm gonna build out my financial security over 30 years and give away most of the money because that's what the Bible says to do. And so these guys are like just blown away. So like I said, I think it's completely worth watching at some point. And I know maybe you guys seems like students, so I'm sure finals are coming up. So maybe over the holiday break, it's worth it. The other thing I wanted to ask was, how many of you guys are in school? A good portion. How many of you guys are young professionals working in the area? Okay, there's some of you guys. Okay, and I'll put a big disclaimer. I'm not a financial analyst, and I'm not even in finance, to be perfectly honest. I'm actually a trained scientist, and I work for a big, huge biopharma company, and I'm in the management side of things, and I work on portfolio and strategy. So not so much, nothing to do with mathematical numbers and budgets and stuff, but definitely not a financial analyst or financial planner. So that's a big disclaimer. But I think at some point you guys should all meet some of those guys, and hopefully the fundamentals that I talk about today should be what they also think about, right? Especially if they have they're supposed to have a fiduciary duty for your benefit and not for them to make tons of money off of you. And so the laws have actually changed in the investors' favor. So I wanted to spend maybe half and maybe 2/3 of the time to really sort of dig a little deeper into what the Bible says and how we should think about it, and then maybe spend a little time I actually have an Excel file that I've done some of the calculations, so you guys can see why. And in 1998, which I also assume that none of you guys were born back then, I was in my financial accounting class in grad school, and my teacher said, all of you guys can easily have $1 million, and it's relatively easy. And he said, and everybody said, how? And we'll go through how actually later. But if you start early, which you guys are young, so I think you guys are already in a very good shape, and you're diligent, then financial security is not that far away. So, what does the Bible say about money, and how do we think about investments? Hmm. Oh, and again, I want it to be somewhat interactive. So if you have questions, just stop me, and I'm happy to try to talk through. Okay. So it seems like you guys didn't have time to talk about the God of Money podcast. And what we wanted to do, and from a question perspective, who here thinks we have a good understanding of money from the Bible? Anybody like have read a few chapters, books? I think Luke is another good one. There's few more, and there's one very famous verse or verses about money itself. So then maybe the question I might ask is money bad? No, not necessarily. But there is one part of the Bible that says evil, right? Calls it evil. And so we can talk about that in a bit. Does anybody have investments already, like going? I mean, you're young. It's not going to be like this, right? So some of you guys already started to invest. Do you know what funds you've invested in or what stocks you've invested in? Do you know what returns you're getting? It's bad. It's good. Okay. And so if you have investments, do you look at the stock charts every single day? No? Does anybody look at the stock charts every day? I mean, I usually have like CNBC up just so I can have a good understanding of what's going on from the overall things. Does anybody get stressed when it goes up or down, or happy if it goes up, and stressed when it goes down? Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to eventually say is there is a big difference between investing and gambling, right? And those are big differences, right? I think investing is smart, what we should do, and gambling you can do it for fun. But if you say, "Look, I'm going to become a billionaire," gambling, it's usually not the way to go. And so in First Timothy, it says, "For love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." So this sounds like money is evil. And do we think that's true? Yeah, I don't necessarily think so. But I think if we break down the verse, it really says that the love of money, you're eager for money, which forces you to wander from faith, right? And those are sort of the key words, right? And we know that our lives are supposed to be centered around God, and as soon as you sort of take that focus away, then it's sin, right? And at that point, I think it's very easy to say that money can be root of all evil, right? And why is that to some degree? Oh, and let's see. Before we go there. So does it really mean that a Christian that has faith cannot have money? There are biblical characters who are faithful and rich at the same time. Does anybody know if? Can you think of any characters? Yeah? Anybody else? Yeah, actually, if you look through the Bible, there are tons of people who God's really blessed, um, and I mean, obviously the kings, Abraham. If you look, I mean, lots of flock, lots of animals. They have tons of servants. So there are a lot of wealthy people in the Bible. So clearly, it can't be evil when these very faithful people have a lot of money, right? So I think again, we don't want to mix up those kind of things, right? God, I think, is is loving, caring, and he knows that we have financial needs. And I think he wants us to be very prosperous, right? That it says so in the Bible, right? It says go and be prosperous. So I think the key is if you just cannot take your eyes off God, right? And God will sort of dump everything on as he sees fit. So I think the root of evil is if the money becomes your God. And again, that's very, very easy to do, I think, in today's society, because society says, life is about money, it's about power, it's about wealth, it's about your individualism, and it really forces the sad the sad truth that exists these days. And if you're, and we've been kind of saying multiple times, focus in our one and true God. Oh, and the one other interesting thing is if you look at, I guess you're not in Boston, but if in big cities, right? Like the people that seem to have a lot of power, clout, are usually people that have a lot of money, right? And so I think a lot of times we all sort of want it, right? And so it's not surprising that money is one of the things that just simply just triggers a lot of emotion. Yep, and so we're sort of repeating, and money is not evil. God, I believe, really wants to bless you, but I don't think He will give it to you until you have that right relationship with Him, and you're mature enough to use it wisely, and think about it wisely. And I think again, I'm sort of learning from that podcast, and it was true for these guys as well. So, what are some of the radical things that the Bible says about money? Well, here's one. Luke 12:16. It says, basically, if we summarize it, it says, money's actually not yours, right? I mean, God's sovereign. Everything is His. So, as much as we think we earn it, it's ours, and it's ours to keep, it's ours to grow, it's actually not true. And there's a couple of good examples in the podcast as well. So we're not owners of the money. We're merely managers, and we're tasked with making the most of it for the short time that's in our hands. And I'm sure you guys also remember the master that gave the coins away to the servant, right? And the guy that he gave, five to? Like he invested, and he did well, and the master praised him. The guy he gave two to, he also invested, did well. The guy that he gave one to, what happened? Yeah, he buried it and did nothing with it because he was afraid. And when the master found him, came back, he said, hey, why didn't you do anything? You're supposed to be a steward. I gave this to you so you can be a steward and actually do something with it. And so, yeah, we are supposed to be stewards. And not only stewards, we are held responsible and accountable for what we do with money. And then a lot of times, I think it can be a tool or a test, and we can use it to love others, be radically generous, and in the Old Testament, that's what it really says, right? Like it says, 1/10 of your tithing, 1/10 of your flock or your grain, and you're going to give it to the poor. So it really has this radicalness that I think for us it's much more difficult to understand and do, especially in today's society. And of course, we all know that we cannot have two masters, right? We can't have God as our master, and certainly we can't have money as our master at the same time. It almost always becomes not God when we have that kind of situation. So, what do we learn so far from what we've been talking about? We know that God deeply cares about money. We also know that God deeply cares about you. We also know that you cannot take money with you, A good example is the guy that had so much grain that what happened? He destroyed his grain silos basically back then, right? The barn, and he built a bigger one. And Jesus said, well, tonight you're going to die. So what's the point, right? So I think again he's talking about your attitude, the way you're thinking, and how you should be approaching. And it's all God's. That's the other, I think, a lot of really important things that we forget about. And my sort of questions that we want to also sort of follow up with is, what's your responsibility for growing that wealth? And if we're called to be stewards, then now what? What do we do? Right? So, any questions so far? I know it's a lot of information all at once, and maybe it's really boring also, because I'm probably like maybe even older than your parents. Okay, so how should we think about it, and how should we think about investing and what it shouldn't be? So I thought we can spend a little time thinking about investing versus gambling. So they both involve risk and choice, right? And the idea is to take capital now. So risk your capital now in hopes to make more later. But if you think about gambling, it's really a short-lived activity. And does anybody know? Hopefully, you guys know what equity means. That usually means stock, right? So equity means equity is something that you think over a long period of time, especially if you have the concept of the Warren Buffett like investing. And if you look at sort of a longer run, gamblers pretty much always are going to have a negative return, right? Because if you're gambling, if you think about a casino, casinos are to make money. And any one given moment, you might hit a blackjack or you might hit the roulette table, craps, whatever that might be, and win some money. But it's set up so that you will lose money in the long run, right? And there's no real way to win unless you can count cards. Yeah, so real estate can also think of it as an equity, right? Because again, that's a long-term thing, right? You're not going to buy today and sell tomorrow. That's highly unlikely. Yeah. And the concept of time we'll talk about. That's one of the most important factors into your thinking about finances or investing in general. And then, so you're going to lose in the long run. On the end, investing usually carries a positive expected return over the long period of time. So, takeaways, investing and gambling both involve risk in your capital in hopes of making money. Gambling and investing, the key principle is to minimize risk while maximizing reward. But gamblers generally tend to lose. Investors, as long as you're smart, generally tend to, and you have a lot of information, right? Gamblers usually don't have a lot of information. And over time, the odds are in favor of the investor and not so much the gambler. So if we continue sort of thinking about it, so I took some of the concepts from Warren Buffett, and it really is about defining investing as transfer to others of purchasing power now with the reasoned expectation of seeing more in purchasing power in the future. So that really tells you about the future. So the word future keeps coming up, and the one of the reasons why it comes up is that one of the biggest components of investing is really time. Right? And so this part also, the foregoing consumption now for consume more later in date, that also says what? Anybody can sort of read into that? It usually means you need to do a little sacrificing, especially when you're younger. So you need to have that some level of mindset. A little bit. And when we and when we talk about how to have $1 million, I think it'll be very apparent. So how many of you guys own stocks? I saw a few hands go up, right? Are you pretty confident in your investment? Very, very confident? Do you feel like you're a true investor, or do you think you're more gambling? Trial and error, okay. Well, we have to learn, sooner or later. Investor, okay. What about you? Uneducated investor, okay. Actually, I opened up a Fidelity Youth account for my daughter, and she has, I don't know, I mean, she saved, like, she's 14, she saved, like, I can't remember, like $3,000 or $4,000. And right now, the Fidelity Youth account, their money market is returning, I think, around 5%. And so she was sort of sitting there going, and I made her look, I think, on the first, because usually they deposit the quote unquote interest at the end of the month. And she looked and she's like, wait a minute, where did this $17 come from? And I'm like, that's the investment side. And then she's like, whoa, this is really cool. I did nothing, and all of a sudden I have extra money. So she was really surprised by that. So does anybody own Tesla? Yes? Yeah? Some people? Few, two, at least two. Three. Did you buy Tesla when it was like $700, or did you buy it more recently? Oh, okay. So you're probably not doing so badly. Yeah. So if you own stock, does anybody know Tesla's revenue in 2022? The folks that own Tesla stock. I think it was around 85 billion. Can you name all of Tesla's competitors? Yep, Rivian. Actually, I think pretty much every single automaker is now their competitor, because everybody's making electric cars in the various price range. So one of their closest, Tesla at 85 billion revenue is pretty good, right? So does anybody know what Toyota made last year? So I think Toyota and or Volkswagen is the largest car company in the world. And I think Toyota made, I think, maybe 240 billion last year. So what I'm trying to sort of get at, and how many of you know where Tesla will be in 5, 10, 20 years? And oops. And then I use Elon Musk, but in general, is the leadership capable of taking the company, bigger and better in the future? So if you want to be a true investor, you should be able to answer all of these questions, right? If you can't, then you may be more gambling, right? Yep, go ahead. Yeah. So that's why I also said I generally read. I don't like stare at CNBC, but I generally will read through the headlines very quickly and see if there's anything interesting that pops up. And I also do that with CNN Business. And this is just my morning normal habit that I do. And so, again, you want to be informed, right? Investing is about information. I remember we said before, gambling, you don't have a lot of information. Investing, you have a lot of information. And if you ask Warren Buffett or the very, very successful financial investors, what do you do most of your time? And they'll say, I mostly read and do research. Right? And that's how they learn, and that's how they figure out, is this company going to be any good? Right? And that's what they're looking for. So how does somebody like Warren Buffett think about himself, right? He thinks of himself as a leader and that has vision and goals, that's able to, in a long horizon, again, the time, and work with other people to accomplish it. Investing, he even I think he even said something, or a few people had said, it's sort of like marriage, right? You're not thinking about buying a stock and selling it next year. That's more like gambling. Like, nobody knows exactly what will happen on a given day to day. But if you really truly believe in it, maybe like Apple, right? And say, Apple is going to continue to innovate and do well, and that's, I'm going to hold it for 10 years, 20 years, then it feels much more like a marriage. So what is a stock? And stock is, part of a business that you're buying into, or part of the company, actually. And you should know what kind of business you're getting into. What are the economic characteristics? What are the competitors? What is the management? So you have to do your diligence. And I think that's what sort of really, really that differentiates from gambling to investing. And I don't know, like most church, especially Korean churches, they're really, really against gambling. And I found out, and I had no idea, because I haven't lived in Korea in many, many years, that our 목사님, who comes from Korea, I think in the last maybe 4 years now, 3 years, he said in Korea, churches don't talk about investing because then people just go crazy about the stock market and everybody's like staring at their phone. And it's like a taboo subject in Korea. And I don't understand why, because church is another place where we should learn about money and learn about like the radicalness of how God perceives money and how we can sort of help each other to succeed together. So what contributes to investing? Anybody taking a finance class or financial accounting? Oh, wow, interesting. Because I figure some of you guys might be in classes about taking some finance classes. I actually would recommend, because I think it's totally worth it to take at least one corporate finance and one financial accounting class, because that will really give you a much better perspective of when we say a company and valuation and present value, future value, like all of the dividends, all of these things will make a lot more sense. So if you're still in school, you have an opportunity to like at least audit the class. I would definitely do so. If you're out of school, I think MIT Sloan has free online classes where they videotape like the professor, and you can just sort of watch them and at least it'll give you the concept. So what is really investing? So these things mean, so FV is future value, PV is present value, R is interest, and N is time, years or time. So investing is actually math. And I think a lot of people think about this as money, and people start to stress out, right, or get emotional when it comes to money. And that's not what you want to do. Like you want to think about it as a mathematical formula of some sorts to get to a goal. And I think as you think more this way and not about, oh, it's like $5,000 or now I have $1 million, like that's not the way to go. And that will make you make some really poor decisions. I have a good friend, and maybe in the 2008, there was a big downturn, right? Lehman Brothers basically collapsed, and the financial industry was collapsing. And they were so scared that as it was collapsing, they were like selling all of their investments. And I'm like, I think that's like one of the worst things you can possibly do. Like, don't think of it as money. Just think of it as a mathematical number that you want to get to. And the mathematics, it really is basically based on this relatively simple formula. So I'll give you an example, and then we can talk more about it. So let's assume that when you retire, you want to live on $50,000 a year, right? So then, how would you do that? Well, what number would allow you to do that? So what way? So to me, the simplest way is, right now, the interest rate is roughly 5%. If you had $1 million, then you would make $50,000 every single year, right? And that $1 million would remain $1 million theoretically forever. So that's how you should think about it. If I want to live on $50,000 a year, or if that's my goal, then what number do I need to hit so that I can do that? And that's exactly how a financial planner, eventually when you guys get old enough and have jobs, that's how they're going to help you to sort of calculate and think about it. And that's the way you should think about it. So it's that 1 million number is your target, and you have to now figure out a way to get to that number. Does that make sense? And the nice thing about doing that says, I'm going to have that $1 million forever, right? Because if you're only living on that 5% interest, you're never touching the principal. And so then your kids will get that $1 million, theoretically. And these compounding, I mean, I'm sure some of you guys who's taken finance, right? Compounding is an extremely powerful and way to grow your net worth. So investing is not money, but it's actually, to me, it's math. And I minored in math, so I kind of like it. And I was a biology and chemistry major, so I took tons of math classes and did a lot of calculations over the years. So when I took finance, I was like, oh my God, it's so easy compared to all the stuff that I was doing before. So again, investing is math. So far, I think we're learning investing in money it's for the long term. It's foregoing something now for later. You need to understand risk. You have to do research. It's math. It's unemotional because it's not money, and it's a mathematical target that you're trying to hit, and it's planned. You have to plan for it. It doesn't happen magically. So building responsible wealth with goal in mind, retirement. The questions you want to ask is, how much money do you make right now, and are you comfortable with it? And not only are you comfortable, are you able to be a good steward? And how do you sort of, how much dollars or mathematical numerical number do you need to sustain your current lifestyle? $50,000, $100 million. And how much money do you need in the future so that you can attain your goal lifestyle? And you have to answer these questions. You can't. So most of everybody that I've met who aren't financial people, they go meet their the financial planner for the first time, and the financial planner says, what's your goal? And everybody almost always says, I just want to make this as big as humanly possible. And then they're like, oh, okay. Then I have to educate you a lot more, so we can talk intelligently about planning and how do we do it. And like I said, everybody can have $1 million, and it's actually not that hard. Actually, can you just put up the Excel file and expand the columns? Because I think normally I do it like myself, and I can expand it as I talk about it. But I think it's just easier if you're just doing it back there. So does everybody believe me if I say you guys can all easily have $1 million? Million to $1 billion? I don't think it's quite that easy. Making $1 million, I don't think is that hard. Actually, I think it's roughly a coffee a day. But $1 billion is a different league. And so, if we can expand column C, D, E, F, I think that would be a huge help. And so if you're about 20, you can say I retire at 60, so 40 years. So 40 years is where it's sort of like the number I start. So as you decrease that time, it becomes, then you got to factor in other things, and it makes it much more difficult. So I don't know how proficient you guys are at Excel. So this is just Microsoft Excel. And I think if you have Fidelity, like some of you, if you have your 401k, maybe it's through Fidelity, and Fidelity's, their algorithm will follow something like this, but I think theirs is a little bit more conservative. Okay, so I was saying, how do you make $1 million? So here's roughly $1 million, right? And so what I said was there's present value. So the current money you have for investing is present value. The annual contribution is another function called payment, but it's a breakup of that formula. Number of years, the N is 40, for roughly 40 years, and the interest, which is R. So here's 8%, 10%, 3, 8, and 10. And then this is just a calculation of if you took the money that you're contributing on an annual basis, multiplied by 40, how much is it? So it's $96,000. But if you're able to make 8% in interest, that $96,000 over 40 years becomes $621,000. If you can do that and make 10% return, you make over $1 million. And this is $2,400 a year, right? So that's $200 a month. And that's what I mean by it's a cup of coffee a day that can make a difference of $1 million in 40 years. And then some of you guys might say, "Oh, Paul, you're out of your mind. You're crazy. None of this is true." Actually, I did all of these kind of calculations when I was 25, and I'm pretty much right on target of where I should be right now. So, like I said, it's math, right? It's not money, it's math. And so the math doesn't lie. None of us can make up the mathematics part, so it works. And then let's think a little bit bigger. So, and the reason why I would also say the younger you are, the more aggressive you need to be, or so more risk tolerant you need to be, right? And the reason why is, look, right now, most of us, if you're working, are allowed to save $20,000 a year in your 401k, and that's tax-free. So effectively, in that first $20,000, or $21,000 now, the government doesn't tax you. So if you made $100,000, instead of being taxed at $100,000, they would tax you at $80,000. Right? So it's a fairly substantial tax savings. But if you did that over 40 years and you only made 3% return, and so if you could multiply this, you put in $800,000, you would have $1.5 million, which isn't terrible. But if you're able to make 8% return, you have $5 million. And then if you're able to make 10% return, you would have $9 million. And I actually did this calculation actually thinking about my daughter, because she's, again, 14. At some point, she'll be 21 and finish college and make some money. And I was trying to think, because I only have one child, and then knowing that I only have one child, it was stressing me out, thinking, oh, what if I don't leave her enough money, and I want her to be comfortable, and what would happen to her, and what if she got sick? So I have all these crazy dad ideas, and I don't know why. And normally I would never think this way. But because I was I'm a dad and I'm worried about my daughter, I'm like, well, how much money can she have, and is she going to be okay? So I did the calculation already. And so I know that she can have around $9 million. And the question is, you would say, very important, right? This 3%, this 8%, and this 10% makes a huge difference, right? This, you're probably not going to be able to retire in 40 years. This, you're going to be very comfortable in retirement in 40 years. So that's why I'm saying risk tolerance when you're young is important. Then you start to think how do you do this? How do you get this 8 and 10% return? Does anybody know what the S&P 500 is? Yeah? What is it? It's the 500 biggest companies in the U.S. Right? It's an index, but a company called Standard & Poor's, they started to sort of track these companies over, I think, since the 1920s, 1910s. And so they've been tracking these companies. And And because these are the 500 biggest US companies, a lot of mutual funds. Anybody know what a mutual fund is? Does everybody know what a mutual fund is? So Vanguard is a mutual fund company. Do you know what it is? Can you explain? Yep, exactly. So mutual fund is a grouping of stocks that they thought were going to be valuable. But if you don't know what stocks are going to be valuable, the one thing you can do is to say, I'm going to basically mimic the S&P 500. I'm going to buy the 500 biggest American companies, and they generally do pretty well. And if you look at the historical, anybody know the historical return of the S&P 500? So historical return of the S&P 500 is a little bit over 12%. So if you knew nothing about investing and you didn't know where to go, if you did absolutely nothing but put all of your money into a Vanguard fund that mimics the S&P 500, you would be in this range. Right? So it's shocking that this $8 million or 8 million number is possible, but it definitely is possible for I think majority of you guys. And this says you know nothing about investments. And you can, as long as you can put it into the S&P 500, you're going to be sort of in this range. And I'm 95 better percent sure that that will be possible because it's working for me. Although I have it, mine is much more mixed than that. But if you take these numbers away and you say, oh, you know what, I'm not going to give up my coffee. I'm not going to give up my car, or I'm going to buy a, I don't know, let's say Honda CRV versus, I don't know, BMW X3, and I'm going to spend the extra $20,000. Well, that $20,000 that you're throwing away is making a huge difference. And if you say, I'm not going to do it now because I need the money now, and again, I don't want to sacrifice their coffee, and I'm going to invest later. Actually, is there anybody back there? Can you make this 40 into a 30? Look, you lose $6 million if you lose 10 years. So time, right? I mean, Warren Buffett, time is a huge, huge factor. So you guys should really, really think early, and it will be an immense help. Yes. The equation is the one. So if you just go in, so the equation is it's a future value equation, and if you type future value in Google, it'll come up with all the financial calculators. If you have Fidelity or any of those investment companies, they all have it. But if you're in Excel, it's future value, FV equals, and then it'll pop up, and it's going to ask you for what is the present value, what is your payment, which is the annual contribution, what is your N, and what is your R, and then it'll calculate this. Yep. Do you have a job? Yeah, so then you can't do it. So 401k is a investment that's set up by your company. Yeah. Yeah, but are you earning an income of some form? Yeah. So once you have a job, you can create. I mean, your company may offer a 401k. You can do an individual retirement account called the IRA, and then there's like a little bit more complex ones called Roth IRA, or not so much complex, but different ones called Roth IRA. If you own your own business, there's the self-employed pension called SEP. There are a lot of things. If you're not, I mean, if you're still an international student and you have some extra money left over, you could, I think, I would think you can open up like a Fidelity or Vanguard account. Or actually, I think a lot of people would skew towards Vanguard because they're actually a very good company and they have very, very low fees. So you can open up a Vanguard account and start putting $200 now, and that way you're well on your way, right? That's another option you can do. Yep. Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I think the reason why I was utilizing 20,000 is because that's the 401k. It approaches the 401k limit right now. If you increase that to 50,000, obviously that number is going to be 2.5 times bigger, right? So the more you can save early, especially when you have a long horizon, makes a big, big difference, right? We just saw, right? 30 years versus 40 years is a difference of almost $5 million. So if you're able, I would say, why wouldn't you? Does that make sense? And then I'll give you a crazy number. So I thought about what happens if I obtain, let's say, this, and I don't need all of this to live, right? So think about it. 5% of $5 million right now is $250,000, right? And that 5 million stays, and you're not even using it. And I would think majority of us would be pretty comfortable and happy living on $250,000. I would think. Maybe not everybody, but I think it would be, that's a pretty good life. And that doesn't even use up this money. So I was thinking, okay, what happens if this is, let's say $2 million, and I never, ever, ever touch that money? And what happens if that goes into not my daughter, but even like the next generation? So if you take $2 million, and then you do this, like, again, 40 years at 10%, anybody know what that number might be? I think it's close to $90 million. And then if you took that to 50 years, it's $240 million. So, like, how does the rich families like start? I think it starts with somebody like us who says, you know what? I'm gonna live comfortably, but I can make my heirs like filthy rich, right? Hopefully, they would also have God's heart, and they'll be generous, and they'll be good stewards. But it's mathematically very possible. Yeah, I think probably one of the most important a financial planner would say is before maybe, I mean, you want to do as much as you can with this, but you also need a nest egg, right? You need like emergency funds, right? And a lot of people say, you want at least 3 months of your living expenses as emergency. And I think, people have different sort of risk tolerances. And some people would say 3 months is not enough. I need 6 months or 1 year. And I'm older and I have family, so I would say maybe even more than that. So I think that's how you would plan. But I think everybody would say at least 3 months, because let's say people that own a home, right? Your mortgage is let's say $2,000. Your car payment is $500, right? And maybe you have school payments of $500. That's already $3,000. Then you got to eat. $500 a week, $2,000. That's $5,000. So that says then you got to pay for electricity, like all of that. So then you're already saying, okay, then I'm going to need at least $15,000 to $20,000 just to leave that in a relatively safe place, just in case. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, yeah. So that's why that's a terrible, terrible thing to do when you're young. Look at the difference. I mean, that's a $7 million difference. You cannot do this. You have to do this, right? You have to be in this range. But maybe you're super, super risk averse, which is okay, right? And you're so petrified of the market that you're only going to do this. Doing this is better than doing nothing, right? Because then you have nothing. So do these things make sense, right? Think of it really, really as math, right? And you should really plan and say, if I want to live on $100,000, and I'm likely to, and when we get older and we have to go more conservative than 10%. So you're not going to do this for all 40 years, realistically, right? At year, let's say 32, you're likely to be dropping this number down because you're not going to take the high risk, and it'll come down. And maybe it's more like a 6% return or a 5% return. So you're gonna make those adjustments over time, and so you should work with a financial planner or advisor, or at least think about it, and get to a number that try to hit the number that makes sense. And it's much easier to get to those numbers when you're young versus when you're 40 and you only have 20 years to go. And then at that point, maybe it's not you're not putting $20,000 away. At that point, you may be needing to put like $70,000 away, which may not be feasible. Yeah, I don't think that's a bad idea at all, right? Because the real estate, you should be able to calculate. I mean, real estate also, you should be able to calculate an annualized return. Because I mean, again, these are all math, right? So you should be able to say the housing market in Providence is this, and the annualized return is 6%, 7%, 5%. And I mean, a broker should be able to do that for you, or you can do it yourself, right? You can look at, let's say, representative 10, 15 houses and say, 20 years ago, what was the value, right? Because there's historical property tax values. And then what is the value now? And then when you do that, then you can re-plug it into the formula and you can figure out what the R is. Hopefully that makes sense. It's just math, like rearranging the math. And there's lots of calculators, like online calculators that can easily, or Excel can do it, obviously. So yeah. So I was reading this earlier today, because knowing that I was coming here, and I think the general rule of thumb is try to put away 15% of your gross income. But so pre-tax. That's like the target, right? But again, when you're young, that might be very hard to do, right? But doing nothing is not good, right? Start. But when I sort of think about this, we're putting money away for our retirement, maybe our children, or if you're thinking like for other school stuff, and then on top of that, you're trying to be generous. I think, I mean, even for me, I would say, okay, that hurts a little bit, right? And then I think when I feel that, then I'm like, okay, then I'm probably in the right range, right? And I'm doing my part of God's work. If I'm saying, okay, here's some money to church and it means nothing to me, I don't know that I'm being the right steward. Does that make sense? You guys had way more questions than the CKPC young adults. Okay. So hopefully a lot of it will make sense. Maybe you'll say, you know what, that guy's still way off. But I think eventually, as you get older, you know, sit with a financial planner. You know, like people, like if you have like a 401k plan, all of the investment companies will sit with you and spend, you know, an hour to sort of look over your stuff and then help you think about it. They usually cannot make a recommendation on exactly what, but if you say, look, this is my target goal, how do I get to, you know, 8%, 10% return? They should be able to say, you know what, you should think about the S&P, the Dow Jones. Maybe you want to think about like QQQ. I don't know if you know what QQQ is, but it's the Nasdaq index, and so they'll give you things to think about. And then the way I also do it is, hopefully you guys like math enough. So a lot of times what I do is I do a weighted average and say, if I want to get to 10%, what do I need to choose when I look at the historical returns of any particular fund or stock? And when I do the weighted average, I can easily figure out a way to get to that number. And I don't know, again, if you know Excel really well, Excel has a good function to do a lot of those calculations for you. Okay. All right, thanks.